Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Kansas City Public Library's online series of signature events. I'm Katie Stover, the Director of Reader Services. In a few moments, we will bring on Dr. Monique Morris, author of Pushout, the Criminalization of I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. I had a technical difficulty there for a moment. We're going to bring out Dr. Monique Morris, the author of Pushout, the Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, and Dr. Lateshia Woodley, Assistant Superintendent of Student Support at Kansas City Public Schools, for a public conversation. Tonight's event is held in partnership with the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation and the Women's Equality Coalition of Greater Kansas City in recognition of Women's Equality Day. I quote now from the White House proclamation on Women's Equality Day issued this morning. 101 years ago, the ratification of the 19th Amendment moved our nation one essential step closer to fulfilling its foundational promise, establishing that no American's right to vote could be denied or abridged on the basis of gender. As we reflect on the decades-long effort to win the fight for universal suffrage, we also remember the women of color who helped lead the movement to ratify the 19th Amendment, whose own rights would still be denied for years to come, despite this hard-earned victory. We celebrate their extraordinary courage and resolve and rededicate ourselves to the work we still have ahead of us to protect voting rights across our country. Here now to tell us about Kansas City's efforts to further the rights of women is Stacy Webb, co-chair of the Women's Equality Coalition of Greater Kansas City.
The Women's Equality Coalition of Greater Kansas City was founded by Alice Kitchen and Gail James to coalesce organizations and agencies to provide free educational programs and advocacy focused on three primary issues for women: pay equity, safety, and voter rights. Our moniker is Pushing Back, Marching Forward. This Friday, August 27th, or tomorrow, at noon, the Women's Equality Coalition is hosting a panel on the status of voter suppression in Kansas and Missouri. To attend this virtual event, RSVP for the link on Facebook at Women's Equality GKC or at the League of Women Voters Kansas City website, which is lwvkc.org. Each year, we partner with the exceptional Kansas City Public Library for an author event to mark Women's Equality Day. On August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. Although truncated due to the pandemic, last year, we were celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, granting women voting rights. This year, we turn our attention to specific issues impeding equality for girls and women of color. The discussion between Dr. Morris and Dr. Woodley should be enlightening, and we look forward to learning from them.
And now the library is delighted to welcome Liz Freeman, the Program Officer for Education at the Kauffman Foundation. Sherman Weitz, Leah McIntosh, and Liz Freeman are the dedicated education team at Kauffman who have brought in Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, Dr. Andre Perry, and now Dr. Monique Morris, scholars who address the issues of race, equality, education, and community. In partnership with this team, the library hosted a series of community conversations on Pushout led by Samara Crawford Herrera of SchoolSmart KC. I hope you had the chance to attend one of them and pick up one of the complimentary copies of Pushout provided by Kauffman. Liz has the honor of introducing tonight's esteemed guest speakers, Dr. Monique Morris and Dr. Lateshia Woodley.
Good evening, everyone. As Katie said, my name is Liz Freeman. The Kauffman Foundation is excited to support tonight's event, and we'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight for this important conversation. Before we begin, I would love to take the time to introduce our moderator and our speaker tonight. Our moderator for this evening, Dr. Lateshia Woodley, was an alternative education student, now district administrator, that specializes in working with at-promise students and turnaround school transformation initiatives. Since 2008, Dr. Woodley has worked as a turnaround leader to help bring about positive changes in some of the lowest performing schools in Georgia and now in Missouri. Believing passionately in the impact of supporting the whole child, Dr. Woodley ventured to work for the Kansas City Public School District. She has had the honor of serving as an assistant superintendent supporting school leadership and now serves as the assistant superintendent of student support services, where she is leading the charge of becoming a trauma-informed school district. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Monique Morris, is an award-winning author and social justice scholar with 3 decades of experience in the areas of education, civil rights, juvenile, and criminal justice. Dr. Morris is the president and CEO of Grantmakers for Girls of Color, a philanthropic collaborative that supports a world in which all girls and young women of color are healthy, safe, thriving, and fully empowered to dream and shape their desired reality on their terms, while dismantling structural barriers created by racism, sexism, and ageism, as well as other forms of oppression that prevent their full participation in our country's future. Dr. Morris is the executive producer and co-writer of the documentary film Pushout, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, which is based upon 2 of her books, Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, Education for the Liberation of Black and Brown Girls, and Pushout, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools. She's also the author of Black Stats, African Americans by the Numbers in the 21st Century, and Too Beautiful for Words. Dr. Morris has written dozens of articles, book chapters, and other publications on social justice issues and lectured widely on research, policies, and practices associated with improving juvenile criminal justice, educational, and socioeconomic conditions for girls and women of color. And now I'd like to welcome the 2 of them to the screen. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I will begin by sharing a little bit about Pushout in this book discussion. I'm really grateful to be able to join you all. Thank you for the opportunity to join you tonight. I've had the opportunity now to spend a little virtual time with the Kansas City community, and I see that you're all very interested in these critical conversations and actions that are about making conditions better for our girls. So thank you for bringing me into this space. As Liz mentioned, I lead a philanthropic organization, Grantmakers for Girls of Color, which we affectionately call G4GC. It's a philanthropic organization that works to advance conditions for girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth who identify as Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, Arab, and other people of color so that they can achieve equity and realize bold and just futures in the United States and beyond. And I love talking about the bold and just futures because we organize within philanthropy to increase the capacity of organizations to support and resource girls of color. And we resource our organizations ourselves that are led by women, girls, and femmes who are working to improve conditions for girls of color. But prior to this work in philanthropy, I was an educator, a researcher, and I founded and led the National Black Women's Justice Institute, where I was engaged in led research, training, and technical assistance to reduce the criminalization of Black women and girls. And as part of that work, I helped to design and launch an educational reentry program for girls who have experienced school pushout. We called it Emerge, which stands for Educating, Mentoring, Empowering, and Reaffirming Our Girls for Excellence. And it's a partnership that continues to exist in the Bay Area between the National Black Women's Justice Institute and a local CBO called the Mentoring Center, Girls Inc., and the County Office of Education in Alameda County. A majority of the girls were referred to us by the juvenile court system. As I mentioned, they had experienced school pushout and were not being served well by any other traditional or alternative school in the county in which it's located. And I offer that at the outset of this book talk because I want to share that my work on this question of how pushout impacts Black girls is not only theoretical or exploratory to me, it's been about engaging in participatory practices that help us discover and test practical solutions to this issue. The most recent data show that after 20 years, we're still grappling with this question of racial disparity and how to interrupt cycles of violence in the lives of Black girls. And while an increasing number of schools are developing alternative practices that are designed to divert students from exclusionary discipline, we know that the racial disparities persist among those who remain along those pathways to confinement. The most recent analysis of data that was done by the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality found that Black girls are about 4 times more likely nationwide than white girls to face suspension and expulsion, and they're 5.3 times more likely to be transferred to an alternative school for disciplinary reasons. It's also worth noting that across the spectrum of discipline, Black girls continue to experience a greater racial disparity than their male counterparts. For example, Black boys are nearly 2.6 times more likely than white boys to experience suspension, while Black girls are 4 times more likely than white girls to experience suspension. And Black boys are just under 2.5 times more likely than white boys to be arrested on campus, while Black girls are 3.6 times more likely than white girls to experience the same. So with Pushout, with the book and also with the body of work that I've been involved in, this has really been about how we elevate a conversation in our community, how we interrogate some of the conditions that are contributing to the racial disparities that we see show up in the discipline data, but also how we can grapple with and deeply interrogate the other conditions that are part of this tapestry of harm in the lives of Black girls with respect to their engagement with educational and learning facilities. Pushout itself is a term that refers to the policies, practices, conditions, and the prevailing consciousness so what we think about Black girls that lead us to a space of rendering them more vulnerable to future contact with the juvenile court and criminal legal system. And with this book, the intention was to build from a study that I'd conducted, a participatory study that I led, much of it a part of my doctoral work, but to really think about what is required for us to build a new ecosystem for Black girls by deeply understanding what their experiences are in so many of our learning spaces. I had gone in and out of schools for a very long time in different capacities and in and out of detention centers, wearing different hats for years, asking young people to describe what their learning spaces were like. And far too many of them, male, female, and across the gender spectrum, really described their schools as prisons. And first I thought they were just, sort of being dramatic about, feeling captive in a space where they didn't want to be. And then I realized that much of our educational spaces really had been built to mimic the conditions of carceral facilities. That there, in addition to the high stakes testing that can push students away, there was a growing presence of surveillance on and off campus that was contributing to young people feeling that they really couldn't bring their full selves to their learning space. Others, policymakers, criminologists, folks who were constructing a narrative about Black youth and other youth of color were describing, conditions that they felt would facilitate safety that relied heavily on the implementation and on this idea that you could bring in what I call instruments of surveillance and agents of surveillance, more law enforcement, security officers, school, security cameras, metal detectors, all of these instruments that were supposed to keep people safe. All the while, young people of color were describing how this was making them feel less safe. And so it was important, in our conversations about understanding how we facilitate equity and safety on campus, for us not to exclude what was happening with girls, for us to understand how bringing girls into the conversation actually makes it a more robust conversation about equity and safety, not a less robust niche issue. So as I started to look at Pushout and started to think about what was happening, much of it really emerged from, and you see in the book, there's a growing conversation. I start with the historical contexts around how Black girlhood has been understood and constructed in the United States, and some of the origins and sort of vestiges of narratives that were created under the conditions of enslavement and deep structural oppression linger in how we understand and interpret the behaviors of Black girls in so many ways. The work that we were doing around combating systems in schools, ideas and policies in schools that were perceived as detrimental to the ongoing development of students was one that favored in so many ways the conditions of Black boys, that I felt that it was really important for us to make this a more whole conversation. I was never one that said that we shouldn't have the robust investment in boys. And I always say that in Black boys, and I really stand by that. I do believe that that was a valuable contribution to this discussion that we're having about elevating equity in schools and examining the disciplinary practices that so many of our young people experience. But I always said that we couldn't invest in a deep interrogation of what was happening with boys to the exclusion of what was happening with girls, that Black girls and boys are sharing systems, they're sharing households, they're sharing communities, they're sharing surveillance, they're sharing relationships in many ways that can render them vulnerable in a host of ways. And that by only focusing on the boys, we were actually not deeply engaged in some of the other aspects of how criminalization manifests in our schools and how we then can combat it. So I stopped using, the more work I started doing with girls, the more I realized that much of the linear way that we had constructed a narrative about the school to prison pipeline was actually leaving out girls. And in 2012, I wrote a paper for the African American Policy Forum that talked about how we locate, where we locate Black girls in the data and in the research that was looking at this idea of the growing criminalization of young people in schools. Basically, it was almost like a lit review to say, when we see Black girls, where do we see them? How are they showing up? What's contributing to some of the conditions of harm in this particular instance? And what I found was that when you're talking about girls, when you're engaging girls, that you can't be linear, that girls in many ways are relational, and a lot of their experiences were related to their relationships with each other, with institutions, and with sometimes the intimate partners in their lives that would require us to do a deeper exploration of multiple pathways to criminalization, not just one. And so while we were seeing case after case emerge in ethnic media, mostly around Black girls experiencing some form of exclusionary discipline, suspension, expulsion, or some reprimand in a formal way for their engagement in schools or how they were showing up to school, that we weren't still seeing it in a way that could present a pattern and a consistent way of understanding how they were showing up and how they were impacted by some of the policies, codes of conduct, and other conditions that might lead to their adultification and dehumanization. So with Pushout in the first couple of chapters, I spend time talking a bit about not just the historical context of Black girlhood in the United States and its relationship to the vestiges of slavery, but also how it leads us to construct an understanding about what we think Black girlhood is today, how we are engaged in understandings that are based upon stereotypes and tropes about Black girls being sassy and combative, about Black girls being rendered or rendered vulnerable to what I call in the book an age compression that we have now built out over time through the work of Dr. Jamelia Blake and the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality on a deep dive into adultification in Black girls, which has shown that adults read the behaviors of Black girls as more adult-like than their white counterparts, where when Black girls are as young as age 5, they are perceived to need less nurturing and protection and comfort than their white counterparts, that they're believed to know more about adult subject matter like sex and to be more independent than their white counterparts. And all of these ways that Black girlhood has been constructed in the public consciousness and imagination then lead to how we engage with them in structures and institutions like our schools. The conversation about adultification and dehumanization has been a really strong one because the other thing that adultification does, in addition to sort of erasing a childhood experience for Black girls, is it denies them also an opportunity to have their trauma be recognized and seen as a part of their lived experience. Too many of our institutions were capturing the responses to the trauma of Black girls as Black girls having a bad attitude, and therefore, not responding to them accordingly and appropriately. There is a chapter in here, I believe it's the second chapter, where I wrote a blues for Black girls when the attitude is enough, because I wanted to have a deeper understanding, first and foremost, of what is the attitude that we say Black girls have, and where does it come from, right? And why doesn't everybody have an attitude? Like, are they paying attention to what is going on in the lives of so many of our girls and how we can work together to combat some of that work. But the other critical thing that I want to elevate before we get into the Q&A about this book is that I spent some time also thinking about this idea of criminalization in schools, not as something that uniquely happens only in community, but that we also think about the fact that girls are learning in carceral institutions, and that those institutions are often underserving our girls and rendering them vulnerable to other forms of harm when they come back into community. Obviously, what we want to do is reduce the number of all children who are in carceral facilities that we call juvenile detention facilities or juvenile detention centers. We know that just one night in one of these facilities can have damaging life outcomes for young people. And so I spent many years trying to be part of communities to bring out and build out a set of robust alternatives and interventions and diversion programs for young people, not just to reduce the racial disparities that we find too many of our young people experiencing, but also just to recognize that these are not institutions that we want our children in, and that we want to try to build out a community that is responsive to their needs, which are almost always rooted in traumatic experiences and disruptions that occur within their own lived experience and environment, not something that is quote unquote wrong with them, but that we have to do this in a way that is gender responsive, culturally responsive, and we have to do it in a way that's connected to some of the core institutions that we know to be at least conceptualized as part of the tapestry of healing and well-being in their lives. And I believe school is one of those institutions. I also am very clear that schools can be the place where we locate a conversation about healing, or schools can be a place where we locate a conversation about harm. For many of the girls that I talked to for the study that, upon which Pushout was based, a lot of those girls talked about the fact that they didn't want to go to school because they saw people getting arrested at school, or they felt like if they showed up at school for something that happened in community, they too might be criminalized for something that was really just a response to them feeling endangered and in danger. So there are multiple complexities that just have been under-theorized in our public conversations about this, but also in how our institutions partner with communities to be more responsive to some of the critical issues that our girls are facing. The other thing that I think bringing girls into the conversation did for this broader understanding of how schools have been undesirably contributing to the criminalization of Black youth is to say, before we brought in girls, we weren't really talking about hairstyles that were being criminalized, like afros, braided extensions, or locks that were being seen as violations of dress code policies. We weren't really talking about the dress code. We weren't talking about the way that dress codes were being enforced in a manner that reinforces some of the readings of Black girl bodies that have been problematic since, again, the institution of slavery, where the Black girl body was a public disposable entity. And so we have to think about how we are reading what Black girls are wearing, but also how we're talking to them about their bodies in schools that reinforces rape culture in some instances, and where girls themselves are questioning whether this is an appropriate way for them to be received when they attend school. So I wanted to elevate some of those questions. And I also wanted to bring into this space a deep conversation about the harms that happen in so many other spaces outside of school, but certainly also in school, that render girls vulnerable to future contact with the juvenile court and criminal legal system. Things like a history of sexual violence and exposure to violence. Often in our public imagination around criminalization, we think about it only in the context of physical violence or state violence, who was shot, who was publicly harmed. And we don't think so much about the harm that happens on a much more routine basis in the lives of so many of our young people, disproportionately our girls, who then attend school and have to face sexual assault in school. Sometimes, we can talk a little bit about that if folks are interested in how that plays out, but in ways that, we have turned a blind eye to and haven't fully engaged, the way that We can talk about disabilities and some of the triggers that Black girls experience when they do have a disability and they're trying to learn and be engaged in the school, but are seen as problematic and or bullied in ways that aren't recognizable. And so I just wanted to deepen the conversation with Pushout. And it feels, 5 or 6 years later that we've really begun to do that. That when I first started having this conversation about Pushout, it was a relatively new conversation for folks. Even though it was recognized by many Black women who had been Black girls in schools, it wasn't something that many other people were understanding as a real phenomenon. To the point where, I was part of conversations about what we should do about our young people. And often I was the only hand in the room that was raised to say, what about the girls? And that's not really the case now. I feel like now, and I'm glad to say that, because I said at the end of Pushout that I hoped that 5 years from the writing of this initial version of the book, that I would not be talking about the same conditions and tapestry, for dealing with this issue. I am still talking about the disparities that exist, and that's problematic. But what I can say is that we've built a much stronger community around responding to these conditions, and more educational systems, more and more community advocates, more and more parents are interested in figuring out their role in being part of the tapestry of healing. It's something that I talk about. I know this is a book conversation about Pushout, but it's something that I spend some time with in Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, Education for the Liberation of Black and Brown Girls. And I think it's important for those who are listening to this conversation to recognize that this is part of a series. There are books, there's a film, there are other materials that are coming. There's a website about ways that we can all be engaged in this conversation, and tools that are available, many of them free, that folks can use to enter this space. So with that, Dr. Woodley, let's have a conversation.
Yes, so I'm always sitting in awe. I feel like I am just so honored to be in your presence today, because here in Kansas City Public Schools, we recognize that a lot of our practices were punitive, and we did a deep equity audit, looking at our disparities, looking at how how race played a role in our discipline practices, how gender played a role in our discipline practices, and so just so honored we utilize your work as a part of our mission of developing a 5-year strategic plan of becoming a model trauma-informed school district. So thank you for having the catalyst to be able to produce this work for us educators to be able to glean from, in order to have a foundation for leading these conversations. So wanted to kind of go back, when I opened the book Pushout, from the very beginning, I was captivated, right? And I believe it was the foreword that really just spoke to my heart. And it talked about Maya Angelou, and it talked about, her trauma, right? The trauma that she was experiencing, and how physically she lost her voice, right? And then it talked about an educator working with her to regain her voice. And so in your talk earlier, you spoke about student voice and the importance of having students to be a part of the conversation. Can you speak more to that?
Yes, thank you for that question. I was blessed by Melissa Harris Perry and her student, Mankapur Kante, to write that forward that talked about student-teacher relationships. And I really love a lot of things about my approach, which feels a little strange to say, but I do love it. I love that a student and teacher partnered to write the foreword that talks about student-teacher relationships, right? And I love, for Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, that the endorsements came from Black girls, not just from adults who talk about Black girls, right? Like, so I'm really intentional about how I structure the body of work that is attached to my name. And part of that is because I have a very strong worldview that those who are at the center of an inquiry should be deeply engaged in that inquiry, that we cannot profess to be the experts in an experience that is not our own. and that there are many ways that knowledge is distributed and shared in community. And we have to acknowledge that finding the voice it's less about those voices not being present. It's more about how we structure our own capacity and build our own capacity to recognize when people might be quiet. And when people are quiet, why are they quiet? And it's not necessarily because they don't have a voice, right? Like I'm actually not a fan of the giving voice to the voiceless framework because everybody has a voice. Mm-hmm. But I do believe that some folks are more quiet than others, and they're more quiet than others for a reason. And so it's about finding the ways that folks can communicate what their interests, needs, and views are, especially if they are at the center of this inquiry. Education is supposed to be a centering of student learning, not about adults being able to control their behaviors, right? Education is about learning, the students learning, right? So it's important for us to think about then what is required for us to really pull out the leadership of those students in order for them to feel like they are co-constructing the learning space. The truth is, and any child sociologist will tell you, young people are co-constructing the environment, whether we recognize it or not. I think I say that in Pushout, is we have to recognize we're all living this experience together, whether we recognize it or not. That just because we are building out institutions and say, these are the rules, you abide by them or get out, doesn't mean that they are not also co-constructing how those rules are going to take shape, how they are going to inform their learning, how they're going to inform our capacity to be responsive. And that, acknowledging it from the very beginning provides an opportunity for us to then say, let's build this together, right? Let's learn together. Let's be a community. Let's be an actual learning community so that, we can advance and grow together. So much of how we have approached education has really been through not through a lens of pedagogical practices that are intended to build out robust learning among young people, right? If we really follow pedagogical practices that are about learning, then we would emphasize safety and healing. We would recognize that young people learn best when they feel safe and when they are in a space that is cultivating their emotional, spiritual, and physical safety. We would understand the expansive, very expansive definition of safety to be that which is much, much more than whether a fight broke out on campus. We would recognize that feeling safe in their learning environment is also about trust and relationships, and that it is about how young people feel the energy of the school reflects them in the school and accepts them for who they are in the school. The schools that kind of understand that are the spaces where, when we talk to girls in those environments, they'll say, I feel safe in my school and I want to be here. The places where that's not actively happening, where there's a greater emphasis on punishment than there is on really cultivating learning, or where there is this belief that the most effective way to curb negative student behavior is through the engagement of exclusionary discipline. Those are the places where young people say they feel like they're in a prison and where they don't want to be.
So one of the things you talked about was talking about creating places of healing versus places of harm. And something else that you speak about in your book is every behavior is a symptom and not the disease. So getting to the root of that, what that behavior is trying to tell us.
Yes, that's especially important, when we're dealing with young people, but I also really feel that that's really a core understanding that should be elevated when we're talking about working with Black girls. That, culturally in many spaces, Black girls are understand part of their gift to the world in being that they are outspoken, in being that they are willing to stand in a space where if they feel there is a system that is unjust or something that is problematic, that they're willing to say, I don't agree with this. And there are so many examples throughout history of Black women and girls standing in those spaces. And in fact, I often talk about how we celebrate them often in Black History Month, and we talk about them in Women's History Month sometimes. And then we punish our girls for engaging in the same behaviors of calling out when something is problematic in their lives and being willing to stand in that space. Now, sometimes, always, young people will use the tools they have available to them. So if what young people have available to them to express their dissent is their physical bodies to fight, they will use it. If young people have available to them structures that engage them in deep conversations when they feel that something is not just and they feel legitimately heard and part of a process where it feels fair and equitable, they will use it. And so it is an interesting thing for me, for us to, talk about how we then build out educational spaces that are part of the tapestry of healing, which is, sort of the framework I use, because, not only should we be informed by the emergent neuroscience that talks about how the brain is actually developing among adolescents and how they're processing equity, how they're processing fairness, how they're processing autonomy, how they're understanding the feeling of safety, and also how they're triggered in certain environments that may remind them of conditions that are not safe in their own communities. I have to say, honestly, law enforcement does not represent safety to all people. And so I think that's something that has become increasingly clear over the last several years, that many in Black communities understand law enforcement to be part of the tapestry of harm. And so if we are inviting them into the schools in ways that are not uniformly regulated, that are ultimately about surveillance, that are in response to every single thing that is problematic in the school, then that's a problem. Actually, that issue came up to me first by a school resource officer. I was teaching in a graduate program, and one of my students was a school resource officer, and she said, I'm often getting called in to do things that are not my job. It's not police work for me to, keep kids from dancing too close at a dance. You know what I mean? And when she said that, I was kind of like, let's talk about that a little bit more. Like, how do you feel you are being engaged in the schools? And, it led ultimately to a study that I did in partnership with Georgetown's Center on Poverty and Inequality that looked at school resource officers and girls of color, which found essentially that those officers who were more likely to engage other aspects of their identities and other skill sets that they had, not the gun or the badge, but the other ways of connecting with youth, that those were the most effective school resource officers, which really meant that you didn't need school resource officers. What you needed was strong youth development workers. Mm-hmm. And that once you built those relationships, then you could cultivate a feeling of safety. And that was something, that I think is an underexplored finding from that study that I hope, people will take a second look at, because we've spent so much time sort of cultivating, again, in our public imagination, that schools have to be places that are patrolled, that schools have to be places where there is deep surveillance. And what we're actually doing is it's priming our young people for lives in carceral facilities, not living into, what their purpose is and how they can build skill sets to inform their way of understanding, what their contributions will be to society, by learning in a safe environment. So there are lots of questions that I think are elevated when I talk about creating schools that are part of the tapestry of healing, because obviously there also needs to be a space where we're talking about the curriculum, or where we're talking about the structure of the school day, the actual physical composition of the school, like how we're thinking about the places where our young people learn, and how we invite parents into those spaces to be partners rather than seeing them in contentious ways or judging them for their own capacity to be in conversation with educators on terms that might not always be compatible. So there are lots and lots and lots and lots of places for us to enter this conversation. And, ultimately the invitation is for us to do, just that.
Powerful. So really, you really speak to the student experience. How can we create spaces that give the student the experience that they need to not just survive their K-12 education, but to thrive and be very successful in building out what we need our girls to be able to be equipped with in order for them to move forward, to be the wonderful young women we know that they're capable of becoming. One of the phenomenons you talk about in the book that is so captivating is this good girl versus bad girl mentality, or our perceptions of our girls, good versus bad girls.
Yeah, that's something that builds from the work of Nikki Jones, who spent, I think, a good deal of time talking about how the perceptions of Black girlhood inform, how we relate to them, how we understand their language, how we understand their knowings. I would say it builds on Nikki Jones and Elaine Richardson, two scholars that have done some work on Black girl literacies and how Black girls are, sort of entering the world, particularly if they are fighters or if they have experienced some form of disruption like sexual violence. And so the good girl versus good girl, good girl, bad girl discussion is really about how society then perceives Black girl expressions. Where if, and historically, Black girls have been adultified, but in many ways, their forms of expression have also been, what we capture as masculinized, which means that a lot of times when Black girls are expressing their opinion, they're seen as aggressive, they're seen as emasculating, they're seen as combative, again, a term that we see show up in some of our school scenarios. And we see, this way in which, we understand their intention to dissent as a way, or they're just their being, as we measure that according to some of the white middle class Christian norms of how we think a girl is supposed to behave. It plays into and invites a deeper conversation about respectability politics, and how we have, how many Black communities have structured identity to try to fit into some of these norms in order to be palatable, in order to be received as legitimately human, and how it has invited some code switching when folks are in mixed company, if you will. However, I talk about it in the context of more deeply understanding than how Black girls who don't code switch, or Black girls who do express in their fullness of their own individual identities, are then received. Just because a girl is a cusser doesn't make her disposable, right? Just because a girl doesn't want to wear a dress, it doesn't make her disposable. There are ways that we have to challenge our own understandings of what is a good girl and also what is a good girl, to help us understand then how we are either inadvertently or undesirably contributing to her adultification, her erasure from narratives, and also potentially, unfortunately, being part of a tapestry of harm if we're trying to reinforce norms that she vehemently rejects. And so, that's increasingly important as young people are expressing across a gender continuum. That's increasingly important if we're going to engage an intersectional lens that allows for us to see people with their multiple identities and how they are interacting with systems and structures. But it's also important for us who are working with young people to not be so concerned about the respectability politics and be more rooted in respect. So when I first started talking about this in communities, I would say, learn how to correctly pronounce her name before you tell her what she's wearing is wrong.
Yes.
Know who you're talking to.
Mm-hmm.
Build a relationship.
Yes.
And ultimately, if you have a critique of her clothing or you have a critique of her behavior, when you approach her with a relationship, you're able to talk to her and reach her differently than if you're just coming to police her body or coming to police her behaviors in a way that she is going to receive as an assault on her being.
Yes.
And so many of the policies and practices and the ways that they're implemented are actually expressions about our own fears, about the vulnerabilities that occur when so many of our young people do live in their fullness and don't have the capacity to code switch, that they're really, this is really a much deeper conversation. But what I wanted to at least start and push out was the invitation for us to understand that our ideas about Black girlhood are complicated and often misinformed by some of these historical narratives and conditions that have laid a foundation for us to, unfortunately, cause harm, even when we don't mean to.
Yes. Powerful, powerful, powerful. As you were speaking, I was thinking about our code of conduct here in Kansas City Public School District and the work that we did to dismantle it because we saw that it was so punitive. And one of the things when you spoke about dress code and looking at our own dress code policy and, really thinking, how does what this child have on affect your ability to educate them? Right. And so really and truly dismantling that whole piece regarding changing policies that are punitive, that are oppressive in nature, and just really looking at how we are able to create cultures of caring for students and families within the district. So one of the other things that kind of stood out to me about your work when you talked about the adultification of girls, and it was in the beginning of the book, one of the young ladies was involved in, I believe, like a sex trafficking type of situation, and then the criminalization of the victims. They're victimized, but then they become criminals as a result of being victimized.
Yeah. So what I wanted to call attention to was the vicious cycle that so many of our girls are caught in when they are experiencing that kind of sexual trauma. And it had not been until this book and a couple of other studies really included in the conversation about school to confinement pathways or school pushout. Folks kind of treated sex trafficking as a niche issue, separate and apart, as a criminal issue, not necessarily an educational issue. And I wanted to highlight how those systems interact with each other to actually deepen the harm when a young girl, in this case, but can be any young person who is experiencing trafficking in this way. And what I describe in the book is a case where a girl had been she had unfortunately experienced sexual harm and victimization. She was being trafficked and exploited in the community, that she had been seen by her classmate on the strip, which made her a target for bullying and teasing in school. So she didn't want to go to school anymore. And when she did start going back to school, because she had been arrested, let me back up a little bit. She had been arrested for trafficking, which already is a problem because she's being commercially sexually exploited. There's been a lot of work in the advocacy community to ensure that we understand that there is no such thing as a child prostitute, no such thing, but that there are commercially sexually exploited children. And she was one of those. She was, what we call in shorthand, a CSEC case, commercially sexually exploited child. And she had been given as a condition of her probation that she had to go to school. And so the criminal legal system, the juvenile court system had entered into the equation because she had been arrested, mandated that she go to school as a condition for her being in community. She was back in community, but obviously being teased by the students who saw her on the strip. Didn't go to school, had enough after she was teased by these girls, wrote, engaged in some graffiti on campus in response to how she was feeling with the girls, and then was expelled because of the graffiti. And so her expulsion actually made her case a technical violation of the conditions of her probation. And so she was put back in the detention facility. Wow. So it was a cycle of somebody who was experiencing deep harm, who was trying to connect in community, she was not receiving the services she needed to get out of that space. The school wasn't really responding to her at all as a unique condition that might require some other types of interventions and some other type of supports in schools. And because none of the sort of pieces were working together, she fell through. And, I met her in a detention facility. And so, I elevate that because in so much of our conversation about school to confinement pathways, about sexual exploitation, we sometimes forget that coupling these systems in that way can sometimes cause harm, and that without a deep analysis around how one will be encouraged to participate in school and part of programming to support her ability to go to school and be in that space, then she's vulnerable to other forms of harm as well.
Powerful. In your TED Talk, you talk about, or you make a statement that education is freedom work. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so I talk about education as freedom work because in this work around criminalization and push out, what I knew from the previous research was that education is a critical protective factor against contact with the juvenile court or criminal legal system. That's something that we know is especially true for girls. That when girls have access to education, when girls are engaged in school, when girls feel connected to their learning environment, they are significantly less likely to participate in underground economies that render them vulnerable to future contact with the juvenile court and criminal legal system. That is something that we see take place with boys as well, but it's especially true for girls. And so when we see that, and when I started to look at that, I thought, we have been constructing all of these creative ways to keep girls out of school, right? To expel them because of this offense, or they're not wearing that shirt, suspension, your hair is braided, suspension, all these creative ways of keeping girls away from their learning, which is actually facilitating a criminalization that does not lead to freedom. But when we emphasize connecting girls to their learning environment, when we think about building out schools as locations where they can feel that they can bring their full selves to their learning, where they can be engaged as scholars, where the people around them can also understand school to be that safe space for them, that's when we're engaged in the work of education as a liberatory tool. That girls with an education are less likely to be incarcerated. And so our work in education is to keep them free.
Yes. Awesome.
So this is freedom work. And the interesting thing about it is, I didn't come up, I say that, but I didn't come up with it, right? Our ancestors came up with that. This is an ancient teaching in many of our communities, the understanding of education as a liberatory tool. When I was writing this piece, much of it because I was drawing upon some of the wisdom of these 17th and 18th century women writers who were interrogating what their conditions in slavery and just coming out of slavery was in the 19th century. Really, I was reading through narratives and understanding how so many were understanding this thing called education, right? This thing called reading and literacy, this way of proving in a lot of ways that they have the mental capacity to interrogate and deeply analyze material such that they could be received as human. And a lot of that was the foundation for the abolitionist movement, right? And so education has always been this critical way that communities of African descent in this country and that other people of color have understood a pathway to participation in the structures that lead to an understanding of freedom in this nation. So, for me, it's about understanding what we want to create in schools so that our young people don't describe them as, little prisons, but that they really understand that schools can be something much more impactful.
Those spaces of healing that you speak about, right? So I wanted to raise the question, how can communities at large engage in supporting Black girls?
So one of the things, when I'm asked that question is that I try to do is just invite communities to actually engage with and see Black girls for who they are, not who we think they are. In so many ways, we render Black girl expressions vulnerable to our own perceptions of what Black girls are supposed to be. If I was that Black girl who I have a very loud laugh, right? When I experience joy, a lot of people know that, right? And it's a hearty laugh. I was not the only one. And I remember being in, various spaces where people would be like, oh, she's too loud. Oh, that's disruptive. So in many ways, I began to understand my joy as disruptive, right? My joy was problematic. And we do that in a lot of ways to Black girls. I remember being in Virginia and, the question was posed, how many of you have been told that your laugh is too loud? And all the Black girl hands went up. And it was interesting because in so many ways, we see Black girl presence as too loud. Too loud for whom, right? And so, I want us to interrogate these questions. I want us to interrogate these issues more deeply and to understand that we have to think through what has been normalized for us and understand that Black girls are going to be Black girls, and that there are so many different ways to be a Black girl that rendering the one you encounter or the few you encounter, vulnerable to your stereotypes about who they're supposed to be is just problematic. But I also think that it's important in thinking about how we support Black girls, to think about how we're building out communities that stand in advocacy with them. When we had the Pushout documentary touring in different communities, we had a hashtag that said "Stand with Black Girls." So many times when Black girls speak their truth, they're left alone. Sometimes that extends into womanhood as well, right? I saw a recent tweet that someone shared that went viral that said, remember that when that Black woman speaks up, for all of you who are applauding, Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles for standing in their truth and being the one who's willing to speak up about the importance of mental health, when that one Black woman is in your meeting and she raises a critical issue, don't meet her in the hallway after the meeting and say, I wish I was as strong as you, thanks for speaking up. Have her back in the meeting, right? Like understand that you stand with Black girls in real time so that they understand that they are valued and they understand that their voice is valid. And so it's one of those things that we don't tend to do, partly because culturally, in so many ways, many Black girls and many Black women, express in a way that makes people think that we're fine. And because we are willing to stand up and speak out, and because we may not show, we may not have a lot of tears that accompany our expressions of dissent or dissatisfaction, people consider us basically that strong Black woman, right? That then leads to other forms of harm, mental health conditions, internalization of toxic stress that make us vulnerable to other preventable diseases. And so I really want, for people to understand that Black girls need support too, that Black girls need engagement, they need leadership opportunities, and they need us to not see them always as combative or disruptive without us being willing to stand with them to say, what is leading to your disruption if you are being disruptive, right? Ask the question about what has happened rather than what's wrong with you. Ask, ask yourself how you are understanding Black girlhood, and then do some deep work around, how you have conversations with them to correct what might be misinformed. I spent a lot of time on the appendix in Pushout, the book, walking through some of the more common questions that I get from community and offering, ways for adults, parents, educators, and others who I call the community of concerned adults, to be in conversation with Black girls. Because a lot of people assume things about Black girls, and then when you talk to them, you get a different picture. But also what I've realized is that very few people ask Black girls what they're feeling about certain issues and how they're processing these things. And so it is important to engage them as critical thinkers. They are critical thinkers, which is often why they are dissenting and often why they get in trouble. So it is important to recognize these qualities as something that can be elevated and worked with rather than disposed of.
Yeah. One of the things that kind of stood out as you were speaking was thinking about the names of our Black girls, right? And sometimes how they are stereotyped based on their name. So Lateshia, my name is a traditional Black girl name, right? And I, often think, and the work that I do, I feel like I'm blessed. I wake up every morning excited about the opportunity to love on babies that need extra love. But I often wonder if my teachers or some of the educators that were a part of my life, if they could have seen, looked at me and see what I could have become and not how I showed up, what my experience would have been different. And so one of the questions from the audience is highlighting what are some of the best practices that educators or trainings that educators need to engage in order to be what our girls need in order for them to get that experience that we need.
I would say one of the best practices is to build relationships, right? So I said earlier in this conversation that you should know how to pronounce her name, right? Names are a big deal. How you show up and how you receive girls and young women is a big deal. I remember teaching a course and I correctly pronounced the name of a Black girl in my class. And she was just sort of walking through, it was the first day of class. I was like, is this how we say, all right, so and so here, sort of roll call. And she said, oh my God, that's the first time anybody's ever had my name right on the first try. And she just made such a big deal about it. And, I let her celebrate because I was like, I get it, right? I get that in so many ways, the creative names that Black girls bring into the learning environment might be new for some people, but it's also, something that as a culture, the creative spelling, creative names speaks to the creativity of our communities. It is one of the few things that we have control of, the ability to name our children. Naming is a sacred practice in African traditions. And it's something that we have to recognize that we spend a lot of time thinking about what these names might mean, where they might be, what they might conjure. If people are calling our child this name for the rest of their lives, what does that bring into the world? Some are more thoughtful than others. Some just really want a beautifully sounding name that sounds, that sort of speaks to some element of their ability to bring something new into the space. Black people are creators. And so it is really important to not make fun of, or ridicule in any way, and learn how to correctly pronounce those names. The naming practices in so many traditional indigenous African faiths and cultures is a very long-standing tradition that is something that many people who are descendants of Africans were able to hold on to. And so when we render folks vulnerable to stereotypes about who they are based upon what we think their names are or how their names fit into American society, we're actually displaying a great degree of ignorance and sometimes internalized oppression. And so, I think it's really important to walk through, a space in developing relationships with young people, learning who they are, learning, about their names. One thing they love, you can create exercises, very early on about what you love about your name. What does your name mean? Where does it come from? How did it come into be? And you can learn a lot about students just by asking them about their names and the origins of their names. Especially, those students who are going to be of African descent, because there is almost always a story behind it. And so, but that's common across the board. It's just about what we value as the story and the culture that it is rooted in. Ultimately, the best practice, there are many. So there are many ways that educators can, begin to cultivate space. I spent some time on that in Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues. A lot of good time on that, and spend more time on that in a forthcoming book that I have about how schools can be locations for the cultivation of Black girl excellence. But I do think that what's critical across the board is the formation of relationships and partnerships that are not based upon, sort of a corporate model of engagement, but rather a recognition of the wisdoms and I would say intelligence that so many communities are bringing to the learning process, and moving and engaging a flexibility that allows for that to work. I think what is really important for educators to recognize is that when young people are expressing dissent, or being what we call disruptive, that they have to recognize that the students who are being disruptive are students who are experiencing disruption. And I say that a lot because I really can't say it enough. I think that, so much of our developed practice around responses to young people who are experiencing moments of dysregulation is to remove them from the school, from the classroom, from the learning environment, rather than thinking about how to build out an infrastructure at the outset that says, if somebody is, set some norms in the classroom. If someone is experiencing a moment of disruption, how are we going to deal with that as a community? Who's going to be responsible for what? I've seen classrooms designed as small villages where each one has a role to play in, cultivating the space in the classroom. I've seen educators walk into schools and say, let's create our own classroom rules together, rather than, me having those set up for you at the outset. Let's create them together using your language, things you understand, and systems of accountability that can help us reinforce that when somebody is a little astray. I've seen schools and educators really design and develop mindfulness practices so that if there seems to be a way that the school, the classroom is dysregulated and sort of building in its, chaos, then they can bring it back because they've established these as norms of the classroom. Breathing exercises, meditation, yoga, other ways that educators can move. And that doesn't only work with kindergartners. Yeah. So, it doesn't only work with kindergartners and grad school. Like I used to tell my grad students, you shouldn't have to wait till grad school for me to ask what you need to be present for today's learning, right? That should be a routine way for us to engage young people around what they need to be present. And so many schools are thinking about cultivating school days to allow for that to occur at the very outset of the school day, to say, you've arrived on campus. Thank you for being here. Go to your space and let's talk about what you need to be present today. Let's set goals for today. Let's figure out how we're going to work together to, build out a space where you feel safe enough to learn. And that allows for young people to build the kinds of relationships and to express what might be brewing beneath the surface, to kind of work on some things, or at least for the adult to identify if a student might need some extra support that day. It's also really important to establish that every student on campus needs an adult that they feel safe and connected to, at least one. And if you don't have it in the capacity of your staff, then work with the community to get some volunteers. But there should be an adult on campus or easily accessible that young person has a relationship with, where they feel safe with that person, where the school has a relationship with that person, so that if that student is in need of some additional supports, there's someone to call who can engage them. We gave an example of that in the Pushout film, where it just so happened that one of the students that was experiencing a moment of dysregulation, her safe person was the principal. She had built a relationship with the principal, but something happened in the school. She was ready to fight. And the teachers knew her safe person was the principal, so they put her on the phone. Like they just called her and was like, she's about to, she's about to fight this other girl. And the principal was able to allow her to come back down and for her to engage in some self-regulation. And so, I think learning these tools and spending time in developing these tools is much more important than spending time and money on instruments of surveillance and this idea that safety can be implemented is something that I've always rejected. Safety is not something you bring in. Safety is co-constructed by the people who are living and working and trying to learn in this environment together. And you do that through relationships. So that's the best practice. The best practice is the old practice. Yeah. The best practice is the ancient practice. Yeah. Love children. Yeah. Love the students that you're with. Love them enough to build relationships with them. And it may not be you. You may not be the right person for every person, but there's got to be somebody on campus that is that person for that student. And every child is capable of connecting with somebody.
Exactly. Powerful, powerful, powerful. This has been a wonderful experience. Thank you. You have given us so many tools to move forward with on our journey here in Kansas City, to really and truly be those healing spaces that students need and creating those culture, the community of caring that we need to build for our students. Thank you for this evening. Have any closing comments?
The only thing I'll say is, I spent a lot of time moving around the country with Pushout, inviting audiences to say with me that Black girls are sacred and loved. And to recognize that when we approach and understand Black girls as sacred, what we're doing is asking you to recognize in them that which you believe to be worthy of engagement and love. And so, my invitation to all of us is twofold. One, to see Black girls as sacred and then to love them and demonstrate that through your actions, aligned actions, but also to think about how you will use the power that you have in your sphere of influence to make things better with and for them. That, Black girls are the experts in their own experience in your community and everywhere. And so as we are thinking about ways to generate new spaces for Black girls, to construct new understandings for Black girls, engage Black girls in that conversation. Think about them as the experts in your community, in the experience that they need to feel like they are sacred and loved in schools and where they don't need to face the adultification, criminalization, and rendering of their trauma as invisible. They are not disposable. They are very special. And I hope that you all agree.
Awesome. Black girls, you are sacred and loved. Final words from Dr. Morris. Thank you for this wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.